Shalom Baruch Hopel as well. I would like to take just a couple of minutes to clarify and to review some of the halachos that are relevant to Shmitas Ksafim and Pruzbul. Now we know that in Eretz Yisrael they are coming to the conclusion of the Shemitah year. Now practically speaking, we don't have that much that we can do here in Chutz La'aretz that we can do to practically hands-on observe the halachos of Shemitah. Of course, we contributed very generously to the farmers in Eretz Yisrael who, through great Mesiras Nefesh, left their fields empty for an entire year. But ultimately, we don't have that much that we can do practically. But there is one mitzvah, one relevant aspect of Shemitah that, at least according to a majority of poskim, is relevant even Bizman Hazeh and even in Chutz La'aretz. And that is the halacha called Shmitas Ksafim. In Parashas Re'eh, Dvarim, Parak Tesvav, chapter 15, Psukim Aleph through Yud, verses 1 through 10, the Torah describes to us that there are basically two mitzvos with regard to Shmitas Ksafim. Number one, that a creditor has an obligation to cancel all debt that is personally owed to them at the end of the Shemitah year. So there's a mitzvahs aseh of shamot kol bal mashe yodo asher yash b're'ehu. The halacha is a person has a mitzvahs aseh that they must forgive the debt. Number two, lo yigos esre'ehu, a person cannot collect the money. So there's mitzvahs aseh and a mitzvahs los aseh. Mitzvahs aseh, a positive commandment to cancel the debt. A mitzvahs los aseh, to collect the debt. In addition to this, there's one more mitzvahs los aseh, which is going to become very relevant when we discuss the practical halachas of Pruzbul, and that is, a person who knows this may think to themselves, you know what, if I'm going to have to cancel all personal debt that is owed to me at the end of Shemitah, I should probably be a roa es hanolad, and I should stop lending money because I don't want to find myself having to forgive that debt. The pasuk warns us very clearly in pasuk Tas, Hishamar lecha, please be very careful. Pen yeh davar im levavcha b'li al lemar. Maybe you'll be very irresponsible, and ultimately the pasuk goes on to describe a person's going to say, I'm not going to lend money. Rather, the pasuk says, nason titein lo, person should give money to a person who needs to borrow money, even though they may ultimately have to cancel that debt. And the pasuk promises us, ki b'glal hadavar hazeh, because of this matter, yivarechecha Hashem elokecha, Hashem will ultimately bless you. B'chol ma'asecha, b'chol mishlach yedecha, we are ultimately guaranteed a beautiful bracha by HaKadosh Baruch Hu if we are going to lend the money without fear that Shemitah is going to cancel it. That is the overview from the Psukim. Now, Lamaisa, the way we paskin, according to most poskim, is that even if a person chooses not to cancel the debt, person chooses not to be mishamet the chov, nevertheless, the halacha is, it's called the nafkata de malka. Automatically, all debts are canceled, regardless of whether a person actually says they're canceling the debt. Now, again, this is subject to a machlokes, which is brought down in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Samach Zayin, in Choshe Mishpat, Sif Aleph, where the Ramah writes, the Mechaber, the Beis Yosef, whose opinion is followed by Sfardim, is that Midoraisa, this is not relevant nowadays, it's only relevant in the times of Yovel. However, the Mechaber writes very clearly, so number two, there's two very important things here. Number one, that midivrei sofa midrabanan, it's relevant nowadays, even when there's no Yovel. And number two, b'chol makom, in every place, even if you're living outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the Mechaber says very clearly, midoraisa min Torah, there is no obligation for a person to be meshamit the chov, to cancel the debt, but midrabanan, there definitely is a mitzvah even bizman hazeh and even in Chutz La'aretz. The Ramah actually goes out of his way to quote an opinion that says it's not relevant nowadays, but he quotes the Rosh, who is very upset about people in the community who are not keeping it, and ultimately, both according to the Mechaber and according to the Ramah, even though there are some dissenting opinions, we keep the mitzvah Shmitas Ksafim bizman hazeh. Now, what is this relevant to? This is relevant mostly to monetary loans. However, it's clear that the halacha is true even if a person lent somebody an item for which they have to pay them back. So now, if you lent your neighbor eggs, or you lent your neighbor sugar, or you lent your neighbor your bicycle, Shemitah does not cancel that. Your neighbor still must return the bicycle, they still have to return the eggs, they still have to return the sugar. However, if they owe you money for it, that is where the Shmitas Ksafim would be relevant. The Mishnah at the end of Maseches Shvius, in the 10th parak of Maseches Shvius, where all these halachas are written out, writes that even though there's a mitzvah for a person to forgive and to cancel the debt, nevertheless, the Mishnah writes something very interesting, that Ruach Chachamim Nochehimenu. Chachamim are very proud and very happy with people who pay back despite the fact that the loan was canceled. So, the process would work. Let's just use Reuven and Shimon. If Reuven lends Shimon money, so then the halacha is Reuven has a mitzvah to go to Shimon and say that he is mishametani. I'm ultimately canceling this debt. Now, if Shimon, the one who borrowed the money, says afal pikein, nevertheless I'd like to pay you back, so then he's allowed to pay it back. That person who says afal pikein, nevertheless I'd like to pay back, the Chachamim are very happy with a person like that. But ultimately he's not obligated to, but it's a beautiful thing for the person to pay back anyway. Now, interestingly enough, if a person lends somebody money, and the person says, you are not obligated to pay back until after Shemitah. In other words, for example, if a person went today and lent money, today is still during the Shemitah year, and said, you're not obligated to pay me back until after Sukkot of this upcoming year, the halacha is that Shemitah is not going to cancel that debt, because the only debt that it cancels is debt that's owed. Since that debt is not yet owed, it's not relevant to the halachas of Shmitas Ksafim. Similarly, if a person lends money and gives a mashkon, so he gives a collateral, in other words, person, for example, lends somebody $100,000, and in exchange, not in exchange, but as a security deposit for that loan, the person gives him something very expensive. He gives him his car, or he gives him a piece of jewelry. In that case, the halacha is, it's as if the loan was already paid back, and therefore Shemitah is not going to cancel that either. It's a bit complicated because often what you're going to find is that the security deposit is not going to be worth the same amount as the actual loan, but nevertheless, if there's a mashkon, then the halacha is the Shemitah does not cancel that debt. Another relevant halacha is if a person buys something on credit in a store. So, this is similar to a case where a person lends money, but the due date for payment is not yet due before Shemitah. So, this is not so relevant here in our community, but there are places, I will share, I was just in the bungalow colony. In the bungalow colony, it's very common, people go to the grocery store, or they send their kids to the grocery store, they have a bill there, and they give their phone number, and they have a bill inside the store. This is relevant in many other stores and other communities where people have a credit in the store. So, a person might think, you know what, I may as well do a very large Yom Tov shopping right before Rosh Hashanah. And you know what? The owner of the store has an obligation to forgive the debts. The halacha is it doesn't work in that case. Shemitah is not going to cancel that debt, and that's similar to the case of before, because the owner of the store does not give a due date that you have to pay before Shemitah. The credit continues to build, but the due date will be at a later point in time, and therefore, since the money is not yet owed, it's not yet due, Shemitah is not going to cancel that debt. Similarly, very important to know, if somebody works for you, schar sachir, the person works for you, you can't just get out of paying that person because Shemitah came. That's also something that a person still owes money for, even if there's no Pruzbul written. The halacha is a person must still pay their employees, even if Shemitah came. So if someone works for you and the payment is due right before Rosh Hashanah, you can't just say, you know what, I'll wait a day and then I won't have to pay my employees. Shmitas Ksafim does not work for that. Now, one of the most important halachas that we need to know is that this is only a personal halacha. This is a matter which is relevant to personal debts that are owed between private parties. However, money that is owed to a beis din or to a larger organization, a community organization, is not going to be forgiven by virtue of the fact that Shemitah came around. This halacha is, as the Psukim said very clearly, Asher Yasha Birei Eyu, V'es Achi. This is talking about halachas that are relevant between private parties, not community organizations. And therefore, we're going to see that the science, the logic of a Pruzbul, which we're going to discuss soon, is if a person is going to transfer their debts to a Beis Din, then they are still collectible because the Beis Din has the ability to continue to collect them. Another relevant point is if a person paid back a loan with a check. So now this is the fascinating discussion. What is the status of a check in halacha? So again, the basic way we view this is that a check holds value, and therefore it is as if it is paid. And therefore debts that are paid for a check that was not yet deposited, most people are going to assume that you still have the ability to cash that check after Shemitah. So if you lent somebody $100 and they came to you on Erev Yom Tov with a check for $100, then you're wondering, hold on a second, I didn't deposit the check before Yom Tov. Can I deposit it after Yom Tov? Or maybe because I didn't deposit it, maybe Shemitah went ahead and canceled that debt. The halacha is that you're allowed to still cash that check. With regard to children, there's an interesting discussion, but people should include their children in their Pruzbul, which we're going to describe soon. But this is only a halacha. This halacha is only relevant between loans that take place between Jews. This is a Jewish halacha of Jewish debt that is owed from one Jew to the next. If there is a business deal that takes place between a Jew and a non-Jew, or if a non-Jew lends money to a Jew, or a Jew lends money to a non-Jew, halacha is that Shemitah has absolutely nothing to do with that. Now, what's this idea of Pruzbul, and what does Pruzbul even mean? Hillel HaZaken noticed that despite the fact that the Psukim were very clear, that a person must be very careful not to refrain from lending money before Shemitah, nevertheless, the reality is that human nature got in the way, and people were not lending money. The Mishnah writes that Kishara'a Hillel HaZaken shenimnu milahalvos zelozeh mechashash shema lo yifra halova eschovo ada shmita v'yasu b'monu v'kach v'avru al mashakasa b'torah yishamar lecha pen yeh davar levavcha blial. Hillel recognized that even though the pasuk said person should not refrain from lending the money, nevertheless people were not lending money because they did not want to lose it if people were not paid back in time. And therefore, he established a concept called Pruzbul. What does Pruzbul mean? So Pruzbul is really a compound of three different words. None of the words are words that we're particularly familiar with, but it comes from pros. Pros means an institution, a takana. It comes from bole. Bole is ashirim, which are wealthy people. And ashirim in this context doesn't have to be really wealthy people, but it refers to people who are able to lend money. And the last part of the word, which is bote, is aniyim, again Aramaic words, which means this is an institution for the rich and the poor. Why is it an institution for the rich and the poor? Because it helps the rich people or the lenders be able to still collect their money, and it helps the poor people be able to borrow money, so like this they're able to survive. So what is this? So this Pruzbul, which is a compound of three different words, is a document. It's a shtar that's written where an individual person hands over their personal debts to a Beis Din, and although the individual person is no longer allowed to collect those debts, but the Beis Din can. And the Beis Din can then go ahead and appoint the individual to collect their debt on their behalf. Now, one of the important things to know is that in order for a person to fulfill or to fill out, to work through this Pruzbul, the love, the borrower, must own karka. Now, we'll describe what it means to own karka, but practically speaking, anyone who has the right to use karka is considered to be an owner of karka in this regard. And therefore, it's almost impossible that you'll have a case where you can't write it unless a person is mamish homeless and has no place to sleep. If there is somebody like that in this community, I think we should be worrying about that a lot more than the Pruzbul over here. But ultimately, now, let's just focus on a couple ideas over here about this Pruzbul. Just to get this one out of the way, there are people who are going to be in Eretz Yisrael, or the opposite, are going to be here in America, who may have some dealings with people in a different time zone. So if you have people who borrowed money from you who live within a different time zone, you should really try to make sure that your Pruzbul is finalized and done before the Love, before the borrower goes into Rosh Hashanah. So if you are in America, United States of America, and you lent money to someone who lives in Eretz Yisrael, you should really try to make sure that your Pruzbul is finalized 7 hours before Yom Tov starts over here. So like this, your Pruzbul will be finalized before that person's loan is forgiven. If you didn't, I can't say that your Pruzbul won't work, but try to get it done in times like this. You'll hand over all your debts to Beis Din before the Lova is able to run scot-free on the loan. Now, if a person has an old loan from the previous cycle that they wrote a Pruzbul on last time, you don't need to write a Pruzbul again. And one Pruzbul, one document handing over your loans to the Beis Din works for all of the people who borrow money. You don't have to write a separate one for every person. You can include everybody inside that one Pruzbul. You don't need to write a separate one. It's important to note that a Pruzbul can be written in any language, and just practically speaking, we here in the shul will give out a Pruzbul. The Pruzbul that I've chosen to use is the one that Rav Heinemann, who's the Marad Astra here in Baltimore, he's the Rav of the Vadakashras, and therefore we're using the one that he used. The RCA has another one, and I'm going to describe soon 2 different types of Pruzbuls that can be used. We'll get that in a very short amount of time. In terms of the way this works is, you have to have a Beis Din. And let's go through this. The way it works is, you have a Beis Din. The Beis Din sits down, as in any case of any real Beis Din, the Beis Din sits down, and the person who's coming forward approaches the Beis Din, and he says to them that he wants to give over all of his loans to the Beis Din. He does that, and then he fills out this form, and the Beis Din, the Dayanim, sign this form. Now, if you'll notice on the document that the shul has, there is a Hebrew document and there is an English document, and the basic words of it read as follows. I'm going to read it to you in English. Again, this is going to give the date, the day of the month, so we're going to have to fill in the date over there. In the city of, we'll write Baltimore. We 3 individuals, signed below, have come together to form a Beis Din. And the lender will put their name over there, has come and told us that due to the fact that this year is a Shemitah year, and that he has documented and or undocumented loans, and it's very important this works both for loans which are milva al peh, just verbal obligations, or if there is a shtar, it works for all of that. So he has documented and or undocumented loans that are due to be repaid to him by others. He is transferring all of his loans to the Beis Din such that he'll be able to collect all of these loans at any time that he wishes, as per the regulations established by our sages in accordance with Hillel's institution of the Pruzbul document, and then the judges will sign that. That is one type of Pruzbul. So the way it works is, you would establish 3 Dayanim. These 3 Dayanim, it is machlokes between the Mechaber and Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, what type of Dayanim they have to be. This is very important for Sfardim to know this, that the Mechaber paskins, they have to be a Beis Din Chashuv. So not just a Beis Din of Hedyotis, not just simple people who don't really understand what's going on here. They have to be very familiar with these halachos and understand what they are doing. So it might not necessarily be appropriate to just choose 3 people, but that for Sfardim, it's important that they should choose a Beis Din Chashuv. The Ramah says any Beis Din of three adults is fine. We try very hard to make sure that they should be Anashim Ksherim, who are learned people. And again, we try hard that they should not be related one to another. So again, this is a Beis Din that it's a bit more serious than other cases, but the Dayanim should lechatchila not be related to each other and not be related to the people who are involved in this case. Okay, so in other words, that's one way that the Pruzbul works. Another way that the Pruzbul can work is if a person wants to use an established beis din. So the RCA actually has a document, and we'll share this as well, where people can sign a document in front of witnesses that they are giving over that loan to a particular beis din. So I'll just read to you from the beis din of America. In the presence of the undersigned, two witnesses there appeared before us. They'll give their names. Be my witness that I am submitting all of my debts owed to me to the beis din of America in New York, comprised of the following judges: Rabbi Mordechai Willig, Rabbi Yonah Rees, and Rabbi Shlomo Weissman, so that I may therefore collect all these debts at any time that I desire. So with that document, in witness whereof, we hereby affix our signatures to this. You give the date, then you have two witnesses. You don't have to have dayanim, just two witnesses, and by signing that document, you are thereby giving it to a beis din chashuv of the beis din of America. So there are two options. Option one, you choose your own beis din, you sit them down in shul, and you sign this document over to that beis din. That beis din takes responsibility for your loans, and then that beis din ultimately gives you the right to go ahead and collect it on their behalf, and they allow you to keep the money. The other way of doing it is that you could have two witnesses affirm that you have transferred your loans to the beis din of America, and those dayanim are Rav Willig, Rav Rees, and Rav Weissman, and those dayanim ultimately will take responsibility for the loan and then give the permission of the creditor to go ahead and collect the money on behalf and then keep the money. It's very important to keep in mind that the Pruzbul only works for any debts that existed prior to the Pruzbul. So if you sign a Pruzbul to somebody on Erev Rosh Hashanah in the morning, and then you leave shul and someone says, hey, can I borrow $20? That $20 is not going to be included in your Pruzbul. And it's for this reason that we recommend that people push off the signing of this Pruzbul until Erev Rosh Hashanah. Because if you'll say, you know what, I want to be an early bird. I want to get this done very early. I want this to be done in, right now, 2.5 weeks before Rosh Hashanah. It's a very nice thing to be an early bird, but ultimately any loans that are going to be initiated between now and Erev Rosh Hashanah are not going to be included in the Pruzbul, and therefore you should postpone it as late as possible. But don't be one of those people who come running into Mincha on Erev Rosh Hashanah and say, hey, I didn't sign a Pruzbul. That's not either a good idea. Try to get it done with a reasonable amount of time. Now we mentioned the halacha that a person, the borrower has to own karka. Again, the way we paskin is that as long as the person has the rights to any piece of karka, to any piece of real estate, that is enough. In terms of gemachin, a gemach, someone lends out money. So technically speaking, if it's a community gemach, that's going to be really under the responsibility of the community. The local beis din will take responsibility for that. They don't need to have a Pruzbul. However, the minig is that everybody writes a Pruzbul. And that's true whether you're a shul, the shul fund, if people owe money to the shul, they write a Pruzbul. The one who's in charge, the mamuna, the gabai, the one who is ultimately in charge of that money, writes a Pruzbul. Someone has a gemach where they lend that money, they should write a Pruzbul. And it's important to note that if for some reason a person can't get around to writing a Pruzbul, they can appoint a shliach. They can have somebody do it for them, and that's also fine. The halacha is true. Men and women, it's the same. Men should have a Pruzbul. Women should have a Pruzbul. A husband can and should write the Pruzbul on behalf of his wife. But if she has some of her own assets, some of her own money, some of her own business dealings that are not relevant to her husband, she could appoint her husband to do it for her, but she should make sure a Pruzbul is done for herself. If a person is not able to write a Pruzbul, for some reason a person is incapacitated or is unable to write it for whatever reason or another, then a person is allowed to write a Pruzbul for this person, even without their knowledge, because of the concept of Zachin La'adam Shlo B'fanav. You're allowed to do something good for somebody, even without their knowledge. So a person can write a Pruzbul for somebody else, even if they are not presently here. That pretty much does it. The only case that's really not discussed is what happens if a child lends money and then becomes a gadol later, or a person converts at a later point in time, if this is relevant, you can ask Kashala to a Rav. But ultimately, the bottom line is that it's very easy and very simple to write the Pruzbul. Anybody who has any reason to believe that they have any debts that they are owed, that they lent money to anybody, should fill out and should write a Pruzbul. We can discuss what happens if a person forgets to write the Pruzbul, whether they can still continue to collect the money. It's an interesting shaila that the post can deal with, because again, when it comes to monetary laws, it's difficult for us to just say a person doesn't owe the money anymore. But especially in light of the fact that there are different opinions whether this is relevant in Chutz La'aretz. But again, every person should write a Pruzbul, should have it signed. And in terms of whether you should write a Pruzbul with a local Beis Din or use the Beis Din of America, if you're uncomfortable with a local Beis Din, you can go with option number 2, the Beis Din of America. I personally will do it with just the local Beis Din. I'll find 3 people, and with that, I will write my Pruzbul locally here in the community, and we'll do it on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you have a better understanding of what these halachos are. Again, this is an opportunity for us to be able to mekayim one of the mitzvahs of Shemitah, Vashmatas Ksafim. As a matter of fact, there are some opinions that it is a proper thing to lend somebody money on Erev Rosh Hashanah, just so that you can say, you know what, Mishametani, I'm going to forgive that, to be mekayim the mitzvah of Shamat Kol Ba Ma'aseh Yado. Essentially, that's not really necessary, because doing the mitzvah of doing the shtar of Pruzbul really helps you fulfill the mitzvah anyway. But again, there are some who say, you know what, let me lend you $1 and please pay me back. And they say, you know what, Meshametani, Kashmita is coming, and the person can say Afal Pikain and still pay it back and have Ruach HaChamim Nochei Imanu. But ultimately, this is an opportunity for us to be Mekayim a mitzvah of Shemitah, even living in Chutz La'aretz. Ksiva v'chasima tova.